Of all the fandoms that I've been a part of, none has been as divided as the Resident Evil fandom. Everybody has a game that they love, and everybody has a game or games that they loathe. And for myself, I usually dismiss a lot of the fandom discourse by just saying that Resident Evil has always jumped the shark. There's never been a moment when Resident Evil has not jumped the shark. It's always been a bit of a B movie. But I don't think that that's entirely genuine. Because if I'm being honest, Resident Evil means a lot to me. Not only are some of my most fond memories staying up late, seeing my mom go through Resident Evil 2, and also seeing my mom set up my aunts and uncles to get hit by that first zombie that's playing dead, but then he bites you as soon as you go near him. I also remember fond nights eating way too many jalapeno poppers with my cousin and going through Resident Evil 0, switching from one character to the other. Moreover, I didn't just love the games, I loved the story. When I was younger, I remember reading all of the Resident Evil novelizations by S.D. Perry and just loving them. They're a huge reason why I read books today, and I don't know if I'd still have an English degree, or much less a master's degree, if it wasn't for those books. But there is something divisive in the fandom, something that I want to investigate, something that I want to explore. When did Resident Evil jump the shark, and what can I get out of that? What can we as creators learn from Resident Evil's shark jumping antics? If we're going to explore that, I think it's important that we start at Resident Evil 1, where it all began. The protagonists of Resident Evil 1, Raccoon City's Special Tactics and Rescue Squad, or STARS, were from the jump highly trained specialists, with Chris Redfield being a 25-year-old ex-Air Force pilot and marksman, and Jill Valentine at 23 being a former Delta Force and an expert pianist. But, much like the commandos of John McTiernan's Predator, the crew found themselves quickly outmatched. They found themselves overwhelmed, having lost Bravo Team and, depending on which character you choose to play, split off from one of their partners. It doesn't take long for the protagonist to find out that the mansion is filled with zombies and all sorts of other monsters. The horror sets in as the characters discover that despite their best training, they just weren't ready for this. The monsters and the mansion itself seems intent on killing them. And of course, as the characters delve deeper into the mansion, they discover an underground laboratory. A laboratory which, to absolutely no one's surprise, is filled with even more monsters. Yet, the worst monster is one Albert Wesker, aka your squad leader, aka the secret umbrella scientist, aka the double agent. And while the confrontation with him is played out differently depending on what character you decide to play as, I think that there's only one way that the story plays out that makes sense for why Wesker is so petty in the future.
Is this?
That's right. This is the ultimate life form. Tyrant! Chris? Stop it.
Wesker, you're pitiful.
It's a fantastic moment, and dare I say, art. Beautiful, beautiful art. And sure, Shinji Mikami would later say that Wesker was always meant to be alive, but come on, we know he was meant to be dead, and we know that any attempted canon was retroactive, and I'm really not sure what's going on with it, to be honest, but that's besides the point. Because I think now we need to talk about Resident Evil 2. See, Resident Evil 1 was a story about a group of underprepared special forces undercovering a huge conspiracy, and going up against a small army of bioengineered monsters, or bioweapons to use the franchise's terminology. Back in 1996, that's really all that the game needed. That's all any game needed. Here's your villain, here's your hero, let's go at it, let's save the day, cool, big explosion, we're done. But that's not what you build a franchise out of. That's not how you make Resident Evil 2. If you want to make a franchise, you need a theme. That's just it. You need some sort of through line, some connection. So while Shinji Mikami was the director of Resident Evil 1, he handed it over to Hideki Kamiya for Resident Evil 2. And Hideki Kamiya is probably someone you know as the creator of Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, founder of Platinum Games, and of course, very belligerent tweeter online. In any case, this was his first game ever directing, and because it's Hideki Kamiya, it wasn't any better. I'm sorry, it wasn't. In fact, when he first tried to make Resident Evil 2, it was a huge flop. It's now known as Resident Evil 1.5 because he did release a demo of it, and it was 80% of the way done. When he realized, and Shinji Mikami realized, that this game was really, really bad. But they took it to someone else, someone they could go and get some sort of affirmation from. Maybe they could do some little fixes and repair Resident Evil 2. The person who they went to was none other than Noboru Sugimura, the creator of many shows in Japan. He had a 2-decade-long career and made things like Kyoryu Sentai Zyuranger, which is known in the United States as Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. This was a big deal. They met with him, they had him discuss everything with him, and at the end of the meeting, he looked at Hideki Kamiya and Shinji Mikami's hopeful eyes and he said, "This ain't it, Chief. This ain't it. This is terrible. This is bad. Throw it out. I don't want anything to do with this. This script is pretty much unsalvageable. There's not even a connection to Resident Evil 1. What are you doing here? Throw this out." There was a sad, sad train ride home, and during this train ride, Shinji Mikami and Hideki Kamiya kind of had this realization. Well, we can either keep making a bad game, or we can start from scratch, making this a 2-year-long game production cycle, something that at the time was unheard of. And ultimately, it's what they had to do, because if this game flopped, so would Capcom. They wouldn't just take Sugimura's advice. They would befriend him, with Hideki Kamiya calling him a mentor for the rest of his life. And they would make sure they bring him on as the primary strategist for Resident Evil's future story development. More importantly than anything, what he brought to the table was a theme. That's right. He brought a central theme. Not just any theme, but he brought Vin Diesel's favorite theme. Family. Sugimura insisted that Resident Evil 2 had to be tied to Resident Evil 1 in a cohesive way. His solution? Claire Redfield. Claire Redfield was the younger sister of Resident Evil 1's hero Chris Redfield. Claire's story would oversee her search for her missing brother, and by proxy would allude to the whereabouts of the other STARS members. She would also meet up with Sherry, who, by contrast, had a neglectful relationship with her parents. Her mother being a top researcher, and her father being a former researcher, now monstrous, multi-eyed monster intent on killing her. Admittedly, there was still a lot going on in Resident Evil 2, and it is a little convoluted. However, there was now a through line. There was a central theme. There was a human element that existed and was strong within it. And the franchise was honestly doing great. The game outsold everyone's expectations, and even though they had to ship it out in 2 discs due to an audio error, it did fantastic. It was great. Good news for Resident Evil, good news for Capcom. Capcom was no longer a sinking ship. And it owed it all to family. I know that not all of Resident Evil revolves around family, but even in Resident Evil 1, one of the most compelling plot devices revolved around the STARS team member Barry Burton, and how he was being forced to serve the team's traitor due to his family being threatened. Eventually, Shinji Mikami would head back to Resident Evil 1 to make Resident Evil 1's remake, which would come out in 2001. And when he did, he would include a new story that involved family even more. The story of the Trevor family is among the series' darkest stories. The Trevor family's patriarch worked as an architect to the Spencer estate. Unfortunately, Tales of Umbrella employees don't usually have a happy ending. To cover the mansion's designs, the Trevor family was killed and experimented on. Most notably, the daughter, Lisa Trevor, would have a strange response to the viruses, which would lead to her torture being the source of the G-Virus. Through various files, the player finds that the monster is one of Umbrella's oldest victims. A victim who only misses her family. To quote Mikami, he wanted players to feel bad for her, to feel a sense of guilt for attacking an innocent victim like her. While 2000 would see Code Veronica's release and the story of Steve Trevor, who is also infected with a virus and who has a human element and is able to redeem himself in the end. The main difference is that Lisa Trevor was an innocent victim. She wasn't a character that was played. She wasn't a character that was a player character. She was just an innocent who was swept up in all of this. And it was something that Resident Evil, honestly, until then, was sort of lacking. This deep narrative of this person who was sucked into it. And the idea that the player got to choose how they interacted with how this person's life their afterlife, I suppose, is respected. One of the interesting things of the architect's involvement is that now the entire map of Resident Evil 1 became canon. It became sensical in a way. Suddenly, there's a reason why these things are so abstract and weird, and I don't know, it made you think about why the mansion was constructed in this way, who constructed it, and what were the repercussions? What were the innocents? Who was lost in the process of the creation of this mansion? There's a deeper backstory, and again, it all revolves around family. When you're looking at things as a creator, one of the questions you often have to ask yourself is, why should the audience care? What makes the audience care? And I don't think it's that Resident Evil didn't make anyone care about things before this point. I think it's much more so that Resident Evil has a tendency to make us care about the wrong things. While Kamiya was very much a believer in Sugimura, and he wanted Resident Evil 2 to be influenced by this man, he also added this scene.
Now what's the problem? Is something following us?
Hey, we still have a job to do. Let's go.
Go? Oh, you can't mean...
Chris, I have to find you.
It was a scene that Sugimura hated because he felt that it was setting up this railroad that would be hard to get off of. And then in Resident Evil Code Veronica, this is how it ends.
I'm sorry, Claire, but it's not over yet. There's still something we've got to do.
You mean...
Yeah! It's payback time. We've got to destroy Umbrella. Now, let's finish this once and for all!
Now, I think the problem with this is that it makes us care about something. The heroes are now triumphant, and now they're going to go be the badasses. They're not going to be the victims. They're going to go forward, and they're going to go on the offensive. And that's kind of where Resident Evil has started to go, right? The heroes are now heroes. They're no longer survivors, they're heroes, right? And the longer that the character stays in the survival horror game, the more of a hero that they become. What's worse is that because of how they set this up as this dramatic drop, that I'm gonna go after Umbrella, suddenly our emphasis as viewers, as players, is, well, in the next game, I'm probably gonna go after Umbrella. I'm gonna watch my character, who's now a badass from me speedrunning the game 50,000 times, and I'm gonna take on Umbrella. It's gonna be this mashup of all of the main characters coming together like the Avengers and taking down Umbrella. And that's not survival horror. So I think these two scenes, that is where the division of Resident Evil comes. And I want to be clear that, yes, I am aware that Umbrella Chronicles and Darkside Chronicles do touch up on this moment in the Resident Evil timeline. However, it is also worth noting that many people did not get a chance to play them. These were Wii exclusive games, and even if they were released later on PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, they're rail gun shooters, which are just not a great experience, at least not if you're playing on a controller. So what you're left with is many of the fans did not get this closure. They did not get this ending. Instead, we take Resident Evil's big dramatic shutdown of Umbrella and we make it a legal case. Not just a legal case, but a legal case which we end up seeing through the opening credits of Resident Evil 4.
With the whole affair gone public, the United States government issued an indefinite suspension of business decree to Umbrella. Soon its stock prices crashed, and for all intents and purposes, Umbrella was finished.
So, think about it. The entire finale of the Resident Evil series has been reduced to this, and it's a little upsetting. If you've been a longtime fan, everything that you've been building to ends up as this. And that's the other thing. In the early 2000s, a lot of video game characters, well, they became heroes, right? They became corporate mascots. You had Master Chief, you had Dante, you had Solid Snake. Leon Kennedy, the police officer, couldn't stand next to them. But Leon Kennedy, the badass of Resident Evil 4, the awesome shoot-'em-up hero doing kickflips and neck drops, yeah, that was the kind of hero we want to represent our brand. because there was this escalation of action movie characters. And I don't know if we talk about that enough, but the early 2000s definitely emphasized this rise of superhero main characters. And it wasn't just Leon, it became the Resident Evil franchise. And again, I do think that those two scenes, cue Chris again.
Yeah, it's payback time. We've got to destroy Umbrella. Now, let's finish this once and for all.
It's hard to watch that scene and then think that Chris is going to stay a normal survivor, right? It's just difficult. I remember being taken aback when I watched this interview.
Chris Redfield, well, let's see, he's the hero, I guess. 10 years later in the series, so he's smarter, stronger, and he's definitely a lot beefier.
It was in the Resident Evil 5 making of disc, and they referred to Chris as the hero. And I just didn't know how I felt about that, not just because he was just one hero of many, because I don't know if I saw Chris as the hero. Maybe a hero, maybe he had heroic tendencies, but to start viewing him as the hero, I think changes the approach to characterization in Resident Evil. But again, that's kind of the expectation that was inherited from Code Veronica. So when Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6 saw the action movie approach to Resident Evil's protagonist, perhaps more so than Resident Evil 4, it just made sense, right? It's something that had to happen. Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6 saw this action movie approach to Resident Evil, and it wasn't just this thing that we kind of noticed. It's even commented on in Resident Evil 5.
Human race requires judgment. And you're going to judge us? Do you get all your ideas from comic book villains?
Albert Wesker, who was this nefarious, super intelligent scientist, is reduced to an action movie villain, and moreover, he's also reduced to like a joke, a meme, right? But here's where I'm gonna get really controversial. I actually think Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6 are good, actually. Like, I know they're not great works of art, but they are very honest responses to the course the series was moving in for some time, and the trends of the time. But with that being said, it is clear that the superhero approach couldn't work while simultaneously instilling horror. Resident Evil protagonists at that point in the series are super veterans, having taken down countless monsters and quipping all the while. It's hard to feel scared when you know the character you're playing as can box a boulder. Like, let's be clear, in every Resident Evil game up until now, in every horror movie really, there's a part about 70% of the way through where the character stops being afraid and starts being a hero, where they start making jokes and start moving in the direction where they are the offender.
You want stars? I'll give you stars.
But that's kind of why it's hard to continue with these characters when they've already become heroes. It's part of why I think Resident Evil 7 made a lot of sense. Resident Evil 7 saw a new protagonist in Ethan Winters with no tie to any previous character. And while players are divided on how much the game made you care about Ethan's wife, Mia, I think the game did manage to bring back the fear of being just an ordinary person stuck in extraordinary circumstances. And yet, it's the only Resident Evil game that I didn't play on release. And I didn't actually play it until I found out that Chris Redfield was at the end. So, like, let me be clear, when I'm, like, attacking you guys, or whatever you might perceive me as doing, I'm included. I am just as much responsible for why Resident Evil thinks they need to keep including Chris Redfield in everything. And that's not me getting into Resident Evil 8, which, like, Chris Redfield's whole characterization is completely lost, and he becomes just a meme. But I do actually really love this line here. Like, that one was really good.
That boulder punching asshole!
It's clear at this point that in Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 8, Chris Redfield's biggest contribution is, hey guys, don't worry. It's still a Resident Evil game. I'm with you. When I first started making this video months ago, I think my thesis was originally something along the lines of, hey guys, let's let Chris Redfield retire. Maybe Chris Redfield isn't that great of a character anymore. Maybe the longer we have him around, the worse things are gonna get. But I can't argue with the fact that I would not have purchased the game was Chris Redfield not in the game. Ultimately, I didn't release that video because it would have been an empty plea to Capcom to do something that, upon further reflection, I don't think they should do. An empty plea which, by the way, I highly doubt Capcom would actually listen to. I think it's important to realize the reason why Resident Evil's protagonists aren't conducive to horror gameplay is because the players have invested so many hours into playing them as badasses. Hell, many in the fan base routinely speedrun these games, trivializing many of the games to under 2 hours. Again, if we're talking about this meta gameplay, then we have to acknowledge the fact that if I've played a game where I've had Claire Redfield run through the entirety of Raccoon City Police Department, go through the lab, and done it in under 3 hours while skipping all the cutscenes, then I have to acknowledge that, hey, maybe, just maybe, like, that's gonna affect how I view the character. And it's gonna be harder to view Claire Redfield, Chris Redfield, as victims, as people who need to struggle to survive, when I know how fast they can speedrun Raccoon City. So what can a creator do when their heroes have overdone the danger, when they are more dangerous than the monsters they're facing? I think the answer is Lisa Trevor. And I don't mean that we just repeat Lisa Trevor. But I think that something to keep in mind when creating horror is that disillusionment is a thing. This goes for books, comics, D&D campaigns, and video games, clearly. The longer you go on, the more disillusioned you are. When you're making a horror story, disillusionment settles in. That is to say that the first couple of times a tragedy happens, it hurts. But once a character realizes that every street they go past, somebody dies, once a D&D character realizes that it doesn't matter what they do, the world is glum and full of terror. I'm looking at Curse of Strahd right now. What that means is that they stop caring. They begin to emotionally distance themselves. And I think that Resident Evil has been there for quite some time. Resident Evil has been a master of mass murder and chaos. And to some degree, at first, maybe it did help raise the circumstances, raise the stakes. But now I don't know if that's true anymore. If all we expect is death and dread, then death and dread will lose its edge. I believe that Resident Evil's protagonists have the potential to deter death and dread, and I and many fans have begun to see that as a detriment, but it doesn't have to be. But it is a detriment unless Resident Evil begins to care about the civilians and the world that these heroes are defending. Resident Evil 6 has some of the most mass casualties in the franchise, but rather than give these moments weight, the characters make comments about revenge and appeal to the player's nostalgia for Raccoon City. What we see in 6 is a world that is truly terrible to live in, and one which viral outbreaks can shatter the world in moments. But the protagonists are more concerned with personal vendettas and the camaraderie they share with one another. I think what Resident Evil is missing more than anything is a lived-in world. A world that makes the players care. Resident Evil doesn't need a large-scale, citywide disaster that one-ups the one before it. What it needs is humanity. In many ways, I think Resident Evil 7 attempted to narrow the lens on how individuals and their families are affected by the machinations of large corporations. And while I concede that Resident Evil 7 wasn't perfect, I can say that it was effective at giving us perspective which Resident Evil had been moving away from for years. I don't think that Capcom should axe its army of super soldiers that are its ex-protagonists. I don't think that that would help at all. But I do think that we should be afraid while playing these characters, and if we can't be afraid for these characters, maybe we should be afraid for the civilians. But that only happens if the civilians are developed. That only happens if we care about Raccoon City again. Well, not Raccoon City. Raccoon City's blown up. That's gone. What I'm saying more than anything is that Resident Evil needs to stop killing every survivor. It needs to stop making us work to keep somebody alive only for them to die like 3 minutes later. It needs to stop having us see a helicopter pilot and know that, well, I wonder how long it is until they get hit by a rocket, because it was cool when it happened with Jill.
It's finally over.
But ever since then, it's just become a staple of the series. More than anything, we need player agency. We need to be given the ability to hope. Once you give players the ability to hope, the ability to wish for things again, then I think we'll be able to feel a little bit of hurt again. It all depends on player agency. It all depends on making us have these moments of light so that these big monumental moments, well, so that they actually mean something. So they don't just become the background of blah and terror. In any case, I hope you liked this video. It's been a long time making, long time in the making, something like that, right? That's what I'm trying to say. Regardless, hope you stick around. I'm going to make more videos in the future. It's probably going to be a while till I make more Resident Evil videos because I've done a lot of research on Resident Evil. Shout out to the book Itchy Tasty. It is one of the main sources of information that I use for making this video. And I mean, shout out to everybody who's followed me here or on other forums, Kwai Wolverine on Twitch. Again, just I cannot say how thankful I am to everyone. If you have ideas for future videos, future things you'd like me to investigate, please drop them down. Thank you guys again, and please tune in the future. Make sure you hit that like button, that subscribe button, and ta-ta for now. Thank you.